Hello again. I'm making another video for you guys in hopes that I can help with the summative assessment piece and the rubric piece. I know it feels complex, but I'll try to break it down as simple for you as I possibly can. I'm starting by showing you the example unit plan that I had given you guys in class 2 weeks ago, just because I feel like when you see something all put together, it's easier for you to then break it down and apply the process of how it was made to your own process of planning your unit. So when thinking about your summative assessment and your rubrics, you're going to want to keep a couple of things in mind. Number one, standards are driving it all, right? We're talking about standards-based, standards-driven curriculum, and the standards you've selected in your unit are going to drive your creation of a summative and are going to be necessary to incorporate when developing your rubric. So first, let's just think about your summative assessment. So in this example unit for high school English, as a group on our curriculum map, we had agreed that we wanted to analyze the choices concerning style, write narratives, and just apply your understanding of language to be able to understand what you're reading and how it's structured and to be able to develop your own stories. So we'd already put these three together, and when we thought about how can we assess all three in a end of unit summative assessment, we agreed that we would have students annotate a short narrative, and that would have them demonstrate the analysis of structure. So that would take care of the reading standard and its impact on audience, which would help them with this standard. And then they could mimic that narrative structure in an original narrative using strong descriptive language, which is another piece of this one. So it's going to hit this one. They're going to write a narrative using effective techniques and well-structured sequences, which is something they learn first here and they can apply it here. So in the progression of teaching it, we already know we're going to progress that way, but by the end of the entire unit, they should be able to do this relatively simply if we have formatively assessed along the way and we knew that they could do this, they could do this, they can do this. If they can do these things independently and proficiently, we're thinking by the end they should be able to show us all three in this summative. So as you're considering what type of summative assessment you should do, really look to your standards and say, what performance task, what one task can students do for me that will allow them the opportunity to show me that they do have the knowledge and the skills in all three of my standards, or all four, or all two, or however many you have in your unit. But that's a key detail. When you write your summative, go back and ask yourself, does my summative measure all three, or did I leave one out, or did I leave a detail out? So do make sure you do that. Now I have gotten a couple of you asking the question, Heather, can I have more than one summative in a unit? And that is feasible. That can happen sometimes. But just make sure there's a logical reason for why you would want a summative to happen before the end of your unit. Because remember, summative is of the learning, meaning that the learning doesn't continue past the summative. Otherwise, it's a formative assessment. So, for example, here, we could have done one and then another one, but we could just be having the students, show us this in a formative way as leading up to the summative. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you feel like the only option is to have two separate summative assessments, then I think that's okay. But just make sure it's purposeful and you're able to explain that either in your annotations or when you conference with me. So I know that your logic shows sound understanding of curriculum development there. So the more important piece that I think will help you with your summative is creating your rubrics. So if I click over to this template. This is the template we essentially used when we created rubrics in class that time. And I would advise, and so would Marzano, and Reinventing Schools, an organization that Dan Joseph, who spoke, is a part of, making a rubric for each standard. So you don't necessarily have to have a rubric that incorporates all 3 or 4 standards that you're looking at in one rubric. That may become a little unwieldy. So it may be easier for you to just take a standard that you're doing and post it at the top, and then just like we did in class, find where this standard is on the Marzano taxonomy. So on this taxonomy, which you still should have, you should find where is your standard on here. And one thing you really want to make sure that you don't do is get too tripped up in the verbs. This obviously isn't a comprehensive list of all verbs, and some of the verbs are in multiple spots. So you really have to almost step back and look at it overall, you know, which area of the taxonomy, which level of understanding and knowledge am I really asking the students to do if they're going to be proficient, if they're going to be able to do this standard exactly. And you may decide that because they have to, you know, infer a lot, you know, maybe it's the standard that some of you ELA folks are using to determine theme. And, you know, you may realize, gosh, to do all of that, they do have to infer a lot. They are analyzing. And so you kind of look at the verbs here, you think about the title here, you think about the overall category title, and you're like, you know what, I think that the standard is at this level, because then you can, you know, name that level here for yourself if you'd like, and you can write the criteria. And I would suggest writing it in the I can statements, right? I can. And in your 3, it can be relatively be the same language as your standard. You just want to make sure it's student friendly. So if your standard is full of jargon, make sure that you break it down so that it's student friendly. So I can certainly show you some of these rubrics that you guys have already, because I gave you copies of them. But for that unit that you have a copy of, one of the rubrics looks like this. It's for that first standard, analyzing an author's structure. You know, we knew that was at this level, and we used that language of the standard. I can analyze how an author's choices create effects as mystery, tension, and surprise by doing these things. So we made sure that if it didn't explicitly state it up here, we explained how I was going to be able to measure if students could do this or not. I'm looking for these specific measurable things in their performance. And this was part of our unpacked skills and concepts too. That's why in the learning objective video, I recommended almost writing your rubric in conjunction with doing your learning objectives, because when you look at, you know, thinking about the progression of a rubric, because you're going to use Marzano's taxonomy, and then you're going to back it down, you know, a level for the level 2, and you're going to determine what level 2 knowledge or skills they would need to be able to do to get them to level 3, and then the same thing with level 1. This may help if you feel like you haven't fully unpacked your standards. Writing your rubric may be a good stepping stone to going back and making sure you've really explicitly accounted for all of the ideas or skills that might be implied by your standards, and that, you know, students have to know or be able to do in order to get there. So so to write a rubric this way for each performance or for each standard, sorry, we call them performance indicators, but for each standard, it might be really helpful just to ensure that you've fully unpacked your standards and that you have a learning objective that will help the students progressively move toward the proficient level on your rubric. And that you also think about, you know, what the advanced, you know, idea is. What if you go up 1 on the taxonomy, what does that mean students are able to do? And you're able to give them opportunities to learn more about that and practice that. And you can see the way we made it to a 4 is by actually incorporating creating their own narrative. So by being a 3 on the writing standard, they're actually reaching a 4 on this reading standard. So we were able to be smart about the way we developed that learning progression. So so that's my first piece of advice when it comes to creating a rubric. Now, there are some of you who would prefer to actually just make one rubric, and you're saying, gosh, Heather, I don't want to make a rubric for every single standard. And if that's not what you want to do, first I would just say, think about it for a second and make sure it's really not, because sometimes it can be really helpful to put each one of your standards in a rubric. It makes it entirely measurable. And when you do go to a school and you do have to report on standards, having a rubric for each standard makes it very easy and very clear to say, yes, the student meets this standard. No, the student does not meet this standard. So that's why I'm recommending that you make one for each standard. However, if you would prefer to do something like this is what Sam has done in our class. And Sam, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to help you out here, use yours as an example, and explain how I might revise this a little bit. She really wants to incorporate everything into one rubric, which I understand, because if you look at her UBD and you look at her standards, a lot of them hit on a lot of the same ideas. So to make a rubric for each one, I think, I don't want to speak for you, Sam, but I'm kind of, guessing here, might feel really redundant that they'd be a lot of similar concepts. So I think she just felt it might be easier, since they all do connect, since they all are part of A, standard 4GA, that if it's almost just a 4GA rubric for the whole thing, it might make a little more sense. So what she has done is broken them up into the components of the standards. So it talks about symmetry, talks about shapes, talks about lines, talks about angles. So at least one or more of the standards will talk about one of these or each of these components. And so she's gone ahead and created the same sort of progression, a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4 for each one of these. However, and she posted this on the TD saying that, she wasn't sure about the use of Marzano's taxonomy. And I think she got caught up in the verbs, trying to find verbs that might be at the lower level. And by doing that, it makes the rubric, if you guys read over it, almost a little too ambiguous or just confusing. You have to remember that the rubric is for your use as a teacher, but it's also for the students' use. You want your students to be able to use it and make sure they are reaching the level that they want to reach. So you got to make sure it's student friendly, and you got to make sure it's easy to remain objective when scoring. So you can easily say, yes, they've done it, no, they haven't. That's really key about a rubric. So if we just think about how we might go about revising or improving this rubric, something really simple and fast that I had told Sam already in the TD is that I probably wouldn't label the proficient as keep working. If you are proficient, maybe this, I would maybe change this to, I got it, or I got it, right? Maybe I got it. I got it. I understand it. It's cool. And maybe the yes up here is fine. Yes, I'm even further than I should be. But I would make sure that we don't let kids feel like they're not proficient when they are proficient. So what I would do if I were Sam is I would go back to my standard and make sure that whatever is said here is almost exactly what my standards say. So let's take a look. So in looking at this UBD and looking at the standard or the standards, it looks like symmetry is only in this last one. And now this might seem trivial or might seem silly, but I would actually even revise the rubric to almost go in progression. So, having this first row be the simplest idea. So the idea of lines maybe first, and then angles, and then shapes, and then symmetry. I would order it that way, so it just almost feels like a checklist for students. Okay, lines, angles, shapes, symmetry, it kind of goes in that way. You'll probably teach it in that way, so put your rubric in the same order. So I might do that first, but in looking at this symmetry row, the only standard that is stated in is this last one. So she's written it as I can classify at line of symmetry. I would think that she either means a line of symmetry or maybe at least one line of symmetry. Correctly use one line of symmetry in my mosaic. Now, when you use the verb classify, you're saying you're going to put it into a certain category, but I don't think that really fits here. So using the language of the standard, if we go back, it says recognize a line of symmetry for a two-dimensional figure. I would almost use that exactly. I can recognize a line of symmetry for a two-dimensional figure, you know, and you could even almost